In August of 1595, 15,000 men faced 100,000 and won. On August 23rd, a Wallachian prince with a double-bladed axe turned the Ottoman Empire's greatest army into a panicked mob drowning in their own ambitions. This is how geography, genius, and sheer audacity humiliated the world's mightiest military machine. Picture this: Ottoman soldiers, the terror of 3 continents, thrashing desperately in muddy water, their heavy armor dragging them down. Their Grand Vizier, second only to the Sultan himself, thrown from his horse into the marsh, saved from drowning by a nameless slave. The Prophet's sacred banner, never before captured by Christian hands, falling into the mud as 100,000 of the world's finest warriors flee from a force 6 times smaller. The fate of Christian Europe hung on a single bridge, barely 20 feet wide. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one man's tactical brilliance turned a marsh into the Ottoman Empire's worst nightmare. You'll discover the secret weapon that wasn't steel or gunpowder, but mud, how a religious relic may have changed European history, and why the Sultan's own banner ended up in Christian hands. But here's what the history books don't tell you, Michael. The brave knew exactly where to position his cannons for maximum devastation, down to the foot. How? What made Sinan Pasha, veteran of countless victories, fall into such an obvious trap? And why did the Ottomans keep attacking the same deadly choke point, sending wave after wave of their best troops into certain death? How could the world's most disciplined army lose control so completely? How did a minor principality's prince outmaneuver the Grand Vizier himself? The answers lie in 6 hours of combat that shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. Among the chaos, one image stands out: a slave, faced with a choice that would echo through history: save the drowning Grand Vizier or seize freedom. His decision would impact the fate of empires. To understand how this David versus Goliath moment happened, we need to go back 3 months. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Now, let me take you back to the summer of 1595, when the Ottoman Empire's massive war machine rolled toward what should have been an easy conquest. The long Turkish War had already claimed tens of thousands of lives across Central Europe. For 3 years, Habsburg and Ottoman forces had clashed in a brutal struggle that turned entire regions into graveyards. But in the small principality of Wallachia, something was about to change. Michael the Brave wasn't supposed to be a warrior prince. Placed on the throne as an Ottoman vassal in 1593, he was expected to be another puppet, sending tribute to Constantinople and keeping his Christian subjects in line. The Ottomans had miscalculated. Within months, Michael had begun planning the unthinkable complete independence from the empire that had dominated the Balkans for 2 centuries. The spark came in November 1594. Turkish creditors, who had economically strangled Wallachia for generations, were gathering in Bucharest for their annual collection. Michael struck first. In a coordinated action across the country, Ottoman creditors and their guards were eliminated. The message was clear: Wallachia would no longer kneel. But here's where it gets insane. Michael didn't just rebel, he declared a holy war. He sent envoys to the Pope, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to every Christian power, proclaiming himself the defender of Christendom's eastern frontier. For a ruler of a principality smaller than modern-day South Carolina to challenge an empire spanning 3 continents was beyond audacious. It was considered suicidal. Enter Sinan Pasha, the Ottoman Empire's iron fist. At 75 years old, he had crushed rebellions from Yemen to Hungary. As Grand Vizier, he commanded absolute authority over the Sultan's armies. When news of Michael's rebellion reached Constantinople, Sinan didn't just mobilize an army. He assembled the largest force seen in the Balkans in decades. This wouldn't just be a punishment. It would be an example to any other province considering defiance. The geopolitical chess game was complex. The Habsburgs were locked in their own death struggle with the Ottomans in Hungary. Poland watched nervously from the north. What happened next defied all military logic. While other Christian powers hesitated, Michael prepared to face the Ottoman colossus alone. He had 15,000 men, limited gunpowder, and a handful of cannons. Sinan was bringing 100,000 soldiers, the empire's finest janissaries, unlimited resources, and the absolute certainty of victory. By August 1595, Ottoman scouts reported back to Sinan. Wallachia's defenses were pathetic. A few earthworks, some hastily recruited peasants, nothing that couldn't be swept aside in an afternoon. The Grand Vizier smiled. This would be over by September. But Michael had something Sinan couldn't have predicted: a perfect killing ground. The Ottoman war machine that crossed into Wallachia in August 1595 was a sight that made grown men flee their villages. Contemporary accounts describe a column stretching for miles, 100,000 soldiers in total, though Sinan would carefully deploy them in waves. The vanguard alone numbered between 12,000 and 40,000 elite troops, depending on which chronicle you believe. Behind them came the main force: Janissaries with their distinctive white caps, Sipahi cavalry in splendid armor, artillery trains with bronze cannons that had breached the walls of countless fortresses. The logistics alone were staggering. Each day, this army consumed tons of supplies. They brought engineers, bridge builders, siege specialists. This wasn't just an army. It was a mobile city devoted to destruction. Sinan Pasha commanded from a silk tent that required 50 men to erect, surrounded by his personal guard of 2,000 janissaries. His war council included Hassan Pasha, the empire's finest cavalry commander, and veterans of campaigns from Persia to Austria. Against this behemoth, Michael the Brave had assembled 15,000 defenders. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up in composition. These weren't frightened conscripts. They were men fighting for their homeland. The corps consisted of 3,000 mercenaries, hardened veterans who had served in armies across Europe. Supporting them was 7,000 Wallachian infantry, armed with everything from muskets to farming implements. The real surprise was Michael's cavalry, 5,000 horsemen who knew every path, every stream, every hiding place in their homeland. But the Ottomans had made a fatal miscalculation about Michael's artillery. The Wallachian force had only 10 to 12 cannons. True. What the Ottoman scouts missed was where these guns were positioned and who was manning them. Michael had recruited artillery specialists from Transylvania, men who understood trajectory and timing with mathematical precision. Each cannon was placed not for maximum range, but for maximum devastation at specific points, points the Ottomans would be forced to cross. Hidden in the forests near Calugareni were the Sakali reserves under Albert Kirali, 3,000 mountain warriors who had fought Ottomans for generations. These men wouldn't enter battle immediately. Michael had given them specific instructions: wait, watch, and strike only when the enemy was fully committed. Patience would be their weapon. This is when physics became Michael's ally. The terrain around Calugareni was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. The Nyazlov River, while not particularly wide, was surrounded by marshland that extended for hundreds of yards on either side. In August, after summer rains, this marsh was a treacherous mix of deep mud and hidden pools. A man in armor who left the solid ground might never emerge. The single bridge crossing the Nyazlov was perhaps 20 to 30 feet wide enough for a merchant's cart, catastrophic for an army. Any forced crossing would be compressed into a narrow column, perfect targets for artillery. But Sinan's scouts reported it as a minor obstacle. After all, Ottoman engineers had bridged the Danube itself. What was one small Romanian river? Then the killing ground revealed its true purpose. Michael had spent weeks studying this terrain. He knew that once an army committed to crossing the bridge, the marshy ground would prevent any meaningful deployment. The Ottomans would have to feed their forces piecemeal into a natural shooting gallery. The forests on either side would mask Wallachian movements while funneling Ottoman advances into predictable paths. On the morning of August 23rd, both armies took their positions. The Ottomans made camp 3 miles from the crossing, their colourful tents spreading across the landscape like a lethal garden. Sinan organised his forces with typical Ottoman efficiency. The vanguard would secure the crossing, engineers would improve the bridge if necessary, then the main force would pour through and crush whatever rabble Michael had assembled on the far side. Michael positioned his forces differently. The cannons were hidden behind earthworks, their positions carefully calculated. Infantry lined the far bank, ready to contest any crossing. His cavalry waited in the forest, invisible to Ottoman observation. Every man knew his role in the deadly dance about to begin. As dawn broke on August 23rd, both armies knew this day would be written in blood. Dawn mist rose from the Nyalov marsh as Ottoman scouts thundered toward the bridge. These were the empire's finest light cavalry, men who had ridden from the Syrian deserts to the Hungarian plains. Their mission was simple: probe the crossing, assess resistance, report back. They never made it. Wallachian horsemen erupted from the forest like ghosts given form. The first Ottoman scout barely had time to wheel his horse before a Wallachian lance found his chest. Within minutes, the entire scouting party was dead or fleeing, their riderless horses splashing through the marsh in panic. But here's what the history books don't tell you. This wasn't random violence. Michael had ordered his men to let some scouts escape. He wanted them to report back. He wanted Sinan confident. Back at the Ottoman camp, the Grand Vizier received the reports with irritation rather than alarm. A few enemy cavalry? Expected. His scouts confirmed what he already knew. The bridge was defended but passable. The Wallachians had earthworks on the far bank, some artillery, nothing his vanguard couldn't handle. Sinan ordered 12,000 men forward his elite troops, the ones who had stormed fortresses from Baghdad to Belgrade. The Ottoman vanguard moved with practiced efficiency. Janissaries marched in perfect formation, their bands playing martial music that had struck terror across 3 continents. Behind them came the assault troops, with scaling ladders and siege equipment, ready to storm whatever pathetic fortifications the Wallachians had erected. The morning sun glinted off thousands of helmets and weapons as they approached the fatal crossing. What happened next defied all military logic. As the first Ottoman units reached the bridge approach, they found something unexpected. The ground, which had seemed solid from a distance, turned treacherous. Horses began to sink into concealed mud. Men in heavy armor found each step increasingly difficult. The neat formations began to compress and disorder as soldiers searched for solid footing. Michael watched from his position on the far bank. He had spent 3 months preparing this ground, having his engineers divert small streams to create additional marshland, disguising the worst areas with rushes and branches. Now, as thousands of Ottoman troops bunched up at the bridge entrance, his artillery captains made final adjustments to their pieces. The psychological warfare had already begun. As Ottoman troops struggled with the terrain, Wallachian drums began a slow, ominous beat. Then came something that made veteran Janissaries pause church bells. Every church for miles around began ringing, their bronze voices carrying across the marsh. To Christian ears, it was a call to divine protection. To Muslim soldiers, it was an alien sound that spoke of the strange land they were invading. But the Ottomans had made a fatal miscalculation. Sinan, sitting in his command tent 3 miles away, couldn't see the deteriorating situation at the bridge. His subordinate commanders, trained to show initiative, decided to press forward rather than report problems. After all, these were elite troops facing provincial rabble. How hard could it be? The bridge itself became a bottleneck of epic proportions. Wide enough for perhaps 4 or 5 men abreast, it forced the Ottoman vanguard to abandon their tactical formations. Worse, the wooden planking, soaked from morning dew and marsh spray, became increasingly slippery as hundreds of boots churned across it. Men at the front were pushed forward by the pressure of thousands behind them, unable to retreat even if they wanted to. Here's where military discipline died its first death. As the leading Ottoman elements finally reached the midpoint of the bridge, Michael's concealed artillery spoke. The first volley was devastating, solid shots smashing into packed ranks at point-blank range. Men didn't just fall, they were blown off the bridge into the marsh below. The wooden structure itself shook from the impact, throwing more soldiers off balance. The Wallachian artillery wasn't firing randomly. Each gun had been assigned a specific zone, their crews drilling for weeks on this exact scenario. As Ottoman officers tried to rally their men and push forward, the second volley struck. This time, the gunners had loaded grape shot, turning their cannons into massive shotguns that swept the bridge clear of living men. But Sinan's troops were veterans. Despite the carnage, Janissary officers rallied their men for another push. Drums beat the advance. Religious banners were raised. The Empire's finest infantry, prepared to do what they did best, advanced through hell itself to achieve victory. They surged onto the bridge again, stepping over their dead comrades, screaming war cries that had echoed from Vienna's walls. This is where heroes and cowards revealed themselves. A Janissary captain named Mehmet led the third assault personally, sword in hand, his men following despite the obvious death trap. They made it 3/4 across before Wallachian musket fire erupted from concealed positions. Mehmet fell with 3 bullets in his chest, his body tumbling into the marsh to join hundreds of others. The morning's combat had lasted less than 2 hours, but already the bridge approaches were carpeted with Ottoman dead. The marsh waters ran red. Wounded men cried out in Turkish, Arabic, and a dozen other languages of the empire. And still, the Ottoman command pushed more men forward. Then Sinan made the decision that would haunt Ottoman military history. Sinan Pasha's order echoed across the Ottoman camp. Send in Hassan Pasha's cavalry, find another crossing, flank them. It was a sound tactical decision that would become a strategic disaster. As 8,000 of the empire's finest horsemen wheeled away from the killing bridge, the main assault began in earnest. The Grand Vizier had decided on overwhelming force. No more probing attacks. He ordered 30,000 men forward simultaneously. The ground shook under the weight of this human avalanche. But the real weapon wasn't steel or gunpowder. It was the terrain Michael had chosen. As thousands of Ottoman soldiers pressed toward the bridge, the marsh revealed its deadly nature. What had seemed like solid ground dissolved under the weight of armored men. Soldiers found themselves knee-deep, then waist-deep in muddy water, their heavy equipment becoming death sentences. The Wallachian artillery had waited for this moment. As Ottoman forces bunched up in the natural funnel created by marsh and forest, every cannon opened fire simultaneously. The devastation was immediate and horrific. Solid shot carved bloody lanes through packed formations. Men simply disappeared, reduced to red mist by direct hits. The psychological impact was even greater. Soldiers at the rear, unable to see what was happening, continued pushing forward, driving their comrades into the meat grinder. Then Michael himself entered the fray. Wearing distinctive armor and wielding his legendary double-bladed axe, he led 2,000 cavalry in a devastating charge across the bridge. This wasn't the desperate defense of a cornered prince. This was calculated aggression. The Ottomans, pressed together and unable to maneuver, couldn't form proper defensive formations. Michael's axe rose and fell like a metronome of death, each swing dropping another enemy. His presence electrified the Wallachian forces, who surged forward with renewed fury. What followed was not combat, it was catastrophe. Ottoman soldiers, pushed from behind and attacked from the front, had nowhere to go but into the marsh. The lucky ones died quickly from Wallachian blades. The unlucky ones, weighed down by armor and equipment, drowned slowly in 3 feet of muddy water. The bridge became so clogged with bodies that living soldiers were forced to climb over their dead comrades, only to be cut down in turn. But here's the detail that changes everything. While the main Ottoman force was dying at the bridge, a smaller Wallachian unit had circled through the forest. Led by a Moldavian captain named Radu, these 500 horsemen struck the Ottoman camp itself. They weren't after supplies or plunder. They were after something far more valuable, the Ottoman artillery park. As Sinan's attention was fixed on the bridge disaster, Radu's men overran the lightly guarded cannons. Within minutes, they had spiked or captured 15 pieces of Ottoman artillery, turning the Empire's own weapons into useless metal. The first phase had lasted 90 minutes. The bridge approaches were carpeted with Ottoman dead. The marsh had claimed hundreds more. Wallachian losses were minimal, perhaps 200 dead and wounded. But the battle was far from over. Through his field glass, Michael spotted dust clouds to the south. Hassan Pasha's cavalry had found a ford 2 miles downstream. Hassan Pasha was the Ottoman Empire's premier cavalry commander. His horsemen had shattered armies from Persia to Poland. As they splashed across the downstream ford, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The Wallachian flank was exposed. In minutes, his cavalry would roll up their line like a carpet. The bridge defenders would be caught between hammer and anvil. The rebellion would end before noon. But Michael had one more card to play. Hidden in the forest, Albert Kirali's 3,000 Sekli warriors had waited for 3 hours. These mountain fighters knew Ottoman tactics intimately. Their families had fought Turkish raiders for generations. As Hassan's cavalry reformed after crossing the river, expecting to face panicked infantry, they instead met a wall of veteran fighters emerging from the trees. The collision was titanic. Ottoman sabers met Sekli axes in a melee that contemporaries described as hell made manifest. But the Ottoman cavalry, magnificent in open field battles, found themselves at a fatal disadvantage in the broken ground near the forest. Horses stumbled on roots and fallen logs. The tight spaces between trees negated their mobility advantage. Worse, the Sekli fought with a coordinated fury that spoke of careful planning, not desperate defense. History pivoted on what happened next. As Hassan's elite cavalry found themselves bogged down in forest fighting, Michael executed a maneuver that would be studied in military academies centuries later. He pulled half his bridge defenders, 3,000 men, and sent them racing to support the Sekli. This should have been suicidal, weakening his main position while the Ottoman assault continued. Instead, it was genius. The Ottoman forces at the bridge, seeing Wallachian troops withdrawing, surged forward with renewed confidence. Finally, the enemy was breaking. They pressed onto the bridge with desperate courage, their officers promising rich rewards for the first men across. They pushed through their own dead, ignored the continuing artillery fire, and actually reached the far bank in significant numbers. Then the trap sprang with devastating precision. The retreating Wallachians suddenly turned. Fresh troops emerged from concealed positions. The Ottoman spearhead, exhausted from fighting across the corpse-clogged bridge, faced a counterattack they couldn't resist. As they tried to retreat, they found the bridge blocked by their own reinforcements pushing forward. Panic spread like wildfire. But the battle's strangest twist was yet to come. On the southern flank, Hassan Pasha's cavalry was disintegrating. The combination of Sekli fury and Wallachian reinforcements had turned ordered retreat into rout. Ottoman horsemen, the terror of Europe, fled through the marsh, many drowning as their horses stumbled in the treacherous ground. Hassan himself, wounded by a Zekli axe, barely escaped with a handful of bodyguards. The Ottoman command structure began to collapse. Sub-commanders couldn't communicate through the chaos. Units received contradictory orders, or no orders at all. Some pressed forward, others retreated, creating a military disaster of epic proportions. The bridge became an altar of sacrifice, where Ottoman military prestige went to die. Michael, watching from horseback, saw his moment. The Ottoman forces were split, demoralized, leaderless in many cases. Their artillery was captured, their cavalry scattered, their infantry dying by hundreds in a battle they no longer understood. It was time for the killing blow. For God and Wallachia, Michael's battle cry carried across the marsh as he led his personal guard in the day's final devastating charge. This wasn't just another attack, this was the stuff of legend. The prince himself, axe whirling in deadly arcs, carved through Ottoman ranks like a ship through water. Behind him came 1,000 of Wallachia's finest warriors, men who would die before retreating. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers, already demoralized by hours of slaughter, saw their enemy's supreme commander personally leading the attack. In their own army, such exposure of leadership was unthinkable. Where was Sinan Pasha? Where was the Ottoman leadership? The answer would soon shock both armies. As Michael's charge smashed into the Ottoman center, the unthinkable happened. The Sultan's sacred banner, the holy standard that had led Islamic armies for generations, wavered and fell. A Wallachian soldier named Stansiu, whose name deserves remembrance, cut down the standard bearer and seized the banner. For Ottoman troops, this wasn't just a military reverse, it was cosmic catastrophe. Allah's banner in Christian hands. The psychological blow shattered what remained of Ottoman morale. Then came the sound that haunted survivors for decades, the great crack of breaking timber. The bridge, weakened by hours of combat and the weight of thousands of men, began to collapse. Ottoman soldiers still crossing plunged into the marsh, their screams adding to the cacophony of battle. The only escape route was gone. This single moment would haunt Sinan forever. The Grand Vizier, moving forward to rally his troops, found his horse stumbling in the marsh. The animal, maddened by the smell of blood and the chaos of battle, threw the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire into 3 feet of muddy water. Sinan Pasha, weighed down by ceremonial armor, began to drown. What happened next remains one of history's great what-ifs. A nameless slave history records neither his name nor origin, saw his master struggling in the marsh. Here was freedom, handed by fate itself. The man who had owned him was drowning. No one would know if he simply walked away. Instead, this forgotten hero plunged into the water and dragged Sinan to safety. His decision saved the Ottoman command structure from complete decapitation and probably prevented an even greater Christian victory. Michael himself was now only yards from the Ottoman command group. Wallachian chronicles claim he personally cut down 3 Janissary officers trying to protect their leadership. His axe, red with blood, had become an instrument of divine vengeance in the eyes of his men. Ottoman resistance didn't just break, it evaporated. The retreat became a rout, then a massacre. Ottoman soldiers threw away weapons, armor, anything that might slow them down. They trampled their own wounded in desperation to escape. The marsh claimed hundreds more, as exhausted men in heavy equipment tried to flee through the treacherous ground. Wallachian cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting down fugitives without mercy. The next 60 seconds would determine the fate of nations. Michael faced a crucial decision. His men were scattered across miles of battlefield, exhausted from 6 hours of intense combat. The Ottoman camp, rich with plunder, lay almost defenseless. But somewhere in that chaos, 60,000 fresh Ottoman troops remained uncommitted. Pushed too far, and victory could become disaster. "Reform the lines!" Michael's order rang out. "Let them run!" It was the decision that marked him as a great commander, rather than merely a brave one. The pursuit was called off. Wallachian forces began the grim work of consolidating their victory. The Battle of Călugăreni was over. The Ottoman age of invincibility had drowned in Romanian mud. The sun was barely past its zenith, but the marshy plain of Calugareni had become an open-air charnel house. As the last Ottoman fugitives splashed desperately through the blood-stained waters, Michael the Brave surveyed a victory that defied all military logic. The bridge that had promised Ottoman glory had become a monument to their humiliation, clogged with so many bodies that the Niagilov River had actually changed course, seeking new channels through the marsh. The immediate task was preventing a counterattack. Michael's commanders begged him to pursue, to turn tactical victory into strategic annihilation. The Ottoman camp lay nearly defenseless, its guards fled or dead. Inside waited the war chest of the Empire gold sufficient to fund Wallachia's defense for years. More importantly, Sinan Pasha himself was somewhere in that chaos, wounded and vulnerable. One more push might end Ottoman power in the Balkans forever. But fate had a twisted sense of humor. Even as Wallachian soldiers began stripping the dead and tending their wounded, Ottoman drums began beating in the distance. The uncommitted reserves, 60,000 fresh troops, were finally moving. Michael's scouts reported massive formations approaching from the east. The Grand Vizier, saved by his nameless slave, had managed to rally the remainder of his army. This is where military genius separated from mere courage. Michael ordered an immediate tactical withdrawal. His men protested. They had won. The field was theirs, but their prince understood what they didn't. His 15,000 men, now reduced to perhaps 13,000 effective fighters, were exhausted, low on ammunition, scattered across miles of battlefield. The Ottoman reserves were fresh, furious, and still vastly outnumbered the Wallachians. The withdrawal was a masterpiece of controlled retreat. Wallachian units pulled back in sequence, each covering the others. The captured Ottoman artillery 15 precious bronze cannons were dragged away by requisitioned horses. The Sultan's banner, that priceless symbol of Ottoman humiliation, was carefully preserved. Even the wounded were evacuated, carried on improvised stretchers by their comrades. But the real victory was written in Ottoman blood. As burial parties later worked to clear the killing ground, the scale of the disaster became apparent. Conservative estimates placed Ottoman losses at 10,000 to 15,000 dead and drowned. Some chronicles claim the number reached 20,000. The elite Janissary Corps had been gutted. Hasan Pasha's cavalry, the finest horsemen in the empire, had lost a third of their strength. Wallachian losses? Perhaps 1,000 dead, 2,000 wounded. A 10-to-1 casualty ratio that belonged in mythology, not military history. But numbers alone couldn't capture the battle's true impact. The Ottoman Empire's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated over 2 centuries of conquest, had been shattered in 6 hours. Here's what the Ottoman chronicles tried to hide. The psychological devastation was worse than the physical losses. Janissaries who had stormed the walls of Constantinople itself had fled from Romanian peasants. The Sultan's sacred banner was gone, carried off as a trophy. Sinan Pasha, the terror of 3 continents, had nearly drowned in 3 feet of muddy water, saved only by a slave's mercy. The immediate aftermath revealed character on both sides. Michael forbade the torture or execution of Ottoman prisoners, a shocking display of Christian mercy in an age of religious war. Ottoman wounded were given the same medical treatment as Wallachian soldiers. Even more remarkably, when Sinan's personal effects were found abandoned on the battlefield, including letters from the Sultan himself, Michael ordered them returned under a flag of truce. But victory extracted its price in unexpected ways. As Wallachian soldiers looted Ottoman corpses, they discovered something disturbing. Many of the dead weren't Turkish at all. They were Christians, Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, even some Romanians, all pressed into Ottoman service. Men who shared their faith had died trying to destroy their freedom. The moral simplicity of Christian versus Muslim collapsed into the complex reality of empire versus independence. The captured Ottoman artillery revealed another secret. These weren't just any cannons. Several bore the marks of Christian foundries, sold to the Ottomans by merchants who valued profit over faith. The same European powers that proclaimed themselves defenders of Christendom had armed its enemies. Michael ordered these particular pieces melted down, their metal reforged into church bells that would ring Wallachia's freedom. As night fell on August 23rd, 1595, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in. A principality everyone had written off as doomed had bloodied the nose of the world's mightiest empire. David had not just faced Goliath, he had left him bleeding in the mud. Word spread like wildfire across Europe. In Vienna, the Habsburg emperor received the news with stunned disbelief. In Rome, the Pope ordered Te Deum sung in every church. In Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed III would reportedly rage for days when informed of the disaster. But Michael knew the truth. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. As he watched the sunset paint the marsh red, eerily mimicking the day's slaughter, he was already planning the next moves. The Ottoman Empire would return, stronger and more determined. Today's victory had bought time, nothing more. The question was, would it be enough? But winning the battle would prove easier than winning the war. The Battle of Călugăreni echoes through history as one of warfare's great paradoxes, a tactical masterpiece that couldn't prevent strategic defeat. Within months, Ottoman reinforcements would force Michael to abandon Bucharest. Within years, the hero of Calugareni would die, assassinated, his dream of a united Romanian state unfulfilled. Yet the 6 hours of August 23rd, 1595, had changed something fundamental in the relationship between empire and principality, between conqueror and conquered. Modern military academies study Calugareni as a textbook example of terrain exploitation. Michael's use of the marsh-bridge combination created what tacticians call a force multiplier, making each defender worth 6 or 7 attackers. His artillery placement, studied through archaeological excavation, shows mathematical precision that wouldn't be out of place in a 20th century defensive position. The controlled withdrawal after victory demonstrates strategic wisdom rarely seen in medieval commanders drunk on battlefield success. But this defeat haunted Ottoman planning for decades. Never again would they underestimate Romanian resistance. Never again would they assume that numerical superiority guaranteed victory. The loss of the Sultan's banner, eventually returned through diplomatic channels, but forever tainted by capture, became a symbol of Ottoman vulnerability that encouraged rebellions from the Balkans to the Arab provinces. For Romanian national identity, Calugareni became sacred ground. The monastery Michael built in gratitude still stands, its bells cast from captured Ottoman bronze still ringing across the countryside. Every August 23rd, Romanians remember the day when their ancestors proved that courage and cunning could humble an empire. The battle entered folklore, growing with each retelling, until Michael's axe could split 3 enemies with one blow, and the marsh swallowed entire Ottoman regiments. The deeper lesson transcends nationality or era. Calugareni proves that military dominance exists only within specific contexts. Change the context, force the enemy to fight where their advantages become liabilities, and David can indeed defeat Goliath. The Ottomans brought the wrong army to the wrong place, pushed forward by institutional arrogance that confused reputation with reality. Consider what this means for any era's dominant powers. The British Empire learned it in American forests. Napoleon learned it in Spanish mountains. The lesson repeats whenever military might meets determined resistance on chosen ground. Technology changes, empires rise and fall. But the fundamental truth remains. The weak can defeat the strong by refusing to fight on the strong's terms. Now you understand why 15,000 defeated 100,000, not through miraculous intervention but through brilliant exploitation of every possible advantage. Michael the Brave turned Wallachian weaknesses into Ottoman disasters. Limited forces became concentrated firepower. Defensive positioning became offensive opportunity. Even the retreat became victory preservation. The Ottoman Empire would endure for another 3 centuries, but something died in that Romanian marsh. The myth of inevitable Ottoman conquest drowned alongside thousands of Janissaries. Christian Europe, watching in amazement, realized the Sultan's armies could be beaten, not just by great powers, but by anyone with the courage and cunning to try. In the end, Calugareni reminds us that history pivots on moments of impossible courage. When 15,000 men stood against 100,000, they weren't just defending a bridge or a principality. They were proving that the human spirit, properly led and positioned, can overcome any odds. The marsh that claimed so many lives also nurtured a legend that freedom, however outnumbered, can triumph over empire, making this not an ending, but a beginning.